The totality of any work of art can be discussed based upon an understanding of its style, form, and content. An understanding of the characteristics of style and form leads to informed art criticism. Identifying the style of the artist or period provides information and background facts about the work, artist, period, and other related pieces of information. Analyzing the form investigates the descriptive qualities of the elements of art and the principles of design as they are used in a work of art. Formalist criticism is the process of evaluating a work of art based solely upon the objective visual characteristics, like the elements of art and principles of design. Immanuel Kant was one of the leading proponents of this type of art criticism. The content and message of a work interact to provide a personal and subjective analysis of the work based upon visual reaction, the artist's intention, or non-factual references that can be made using information from both its context and formal characteristics. Style is the distinctive handling of elements, usually associated with one artist or a movement. When the work of an individual, a school of artists, a culture, or an era of time has a set of unique and defining characteristics, it can be characterized and identified as style. Form refers to all the visual elements of a work of art, the overall organization of that work. The content of a work refers to the subject matter. The message is a communication between artist and viewer. In art, content, subject matter, and message are interrelated. Content can refer to the subject matter or to a message. Artists add visual cues to create a specific message in their work. The following works have content portraying men and women, but each with a particular message. The first work is an expressionist painting by Oskar Kokoschka. Kokoschka is seen in self-portrait embraced by Alma Mahler, widow of the famous composer Gustav Mahler. Kokoschka used distorted colors and figures to create a psychological portrayal of a stormy relationship in which the downward spiral of a whirlpool or maelstrom encompasses the couple with no indication of escape. During their passionate and tumultuous 3-year relationship, Oskar Kokoschka was clearly overwhelmed with jealousy of the worldliness of Alma's personal life. Even as Kokoschka portrays Alma comfortably asleep while he lies with eyes wide open, no amount of his vigilance would keep the couple united. Alma married the Bauhaus architect Walter Gropius during Kokoschka's enlistment in the army during World War I. Years later, Kokoschka wrote, "We are united for eternity in my Bride of the Wind." This Roy Lichtenstein painting, Forget It, Forget Me, portrays the cliched tough man of action leaving love behind. The pop art style revered mass-produced images of popular culture. Lichtenstein paints a faithful reproduction of a cartoon image, with its speech bubbled rendered in the inexpressive lines and flat colors of commercial printing. In the Middle Ages, Lucas Cranach the Elder developed a following for paintings of mismatched couples. In The Amorous Old Woman and Young Man of 1520-22, Cranach shows both figures meeting the needs of the other through adoring looks and monetary gifts. Jacques-Louis David glorifies the pyramidal strength of the male gender in this painting of the sons and daughters of the Horatius family. During the French Revolution, art was used as a tool for political change. In The Oath of the Horatii, David is visually retelling the story of the ancient Roman Republic, which illustrated loyalty to homeland. In this illustration of an ancient story, French citizens viewing this work understood a thinly veiled message, a call to take up arms against their own king and possibly even their own kinsmen for the good of the country.
We're in the Musée du Louvre and we're looking at Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of the Horatii. Now, sometimes it's pronounced Horatii. We don't know how to pronounce Latin, but it's an extraordinary story that has a real place in the revolutionary history of France.
It was exhibited in 1785, 4 years before the Revolution, and it tells a rather complicated story.
So this is the story of warfare between a very young Rome and a neighboring city, Alba. These were two tribes that were in constant conflict, and rather than do battle city against city, both of the cities decided that they would choose 3 combatants on each side. Whoever won that battle would win the war. On the Roman side, the Horatii brothers are chosen, and they are shown here taking an oath that they will fight to the death on behalf of their city. Their father holds their swords aloft and their relatives mourn the coming battle on the right.
This is taken from a source from ancient Roman history, from Livy. There were other contemporary sources, but David is inventing this moment of the oath-taking, focusing on the idea of a willingness to die for one's country, for a principle. One of the sisters that we see here of the Horatii is married to one of the Curatii brothers,
The opposing side from Alba.
so she's going to lose either her husband or her brother.
As it turns out, she loses her husband, and then her brother kills her.
He comes back from the battle. Rome is victorious, only to find that his sister is disturbed by the death of her husband, and he kills her because one should be guided by one's feelings of patriotism and not personal feelings about family.
So this notion of family, the notion of personal concern, is seen as secondary, and it's hard not to then extrapolate from that some of the issues that are taking place in contemporary France when David is painting this in 1784. And that has to do with the luxury that is loved by the aristocracy, as opposed to, in a sense, the heroism that David seems to be calling for here. You know, where is the sacrifice? We can pull through this together if, in a sense, the good of the state is put at the fore. This is a really powerful idea at this historical moment. This is just 4 years before the Revolution, and this is a moment when there's tremendous unease with the monarchy, and especially with the aristocracy. In France at this moment, the aristocracy is living an extraordinary life at a time when the nation itself is bankrupt. And so this notion of willingness to sacrifice oneself was a very powerful ideal that David is bringing into the political narrative of this moment. Now, it's important to note that the painting was not made in France. It was not made in Paris. It was made in Rome. He decided to look closely at antiquity, specifically at ancient Roman sculpture and painting and friezes. And when you look at this painting, there is a radical break with the Rococo that came before it. This is the birth of neoclassicism. And what we see is a frieze of figures that look as if they might have come off a Greek vase.
David seems to be really emphasizing a severity and starkness. The space itself could not be simpler. It's divided into three by these round Roman arches, very severe Doric order, a shallow space created by the use of linear perspective, and figures painted in a very linear style with firm contours and a real interest in human anatomy, in drapery that reveals the form of the body underneath it. And so we really do see David's interest in ancient Greek and Roman art.
David has used a raking light, that is, light is passing across the surface of the canvas, across the surface of those men, so that there's a tremendously sharp contrast. And the space, as you said, is perfect and geometric and very rational. All of this geometry is meant to evoke this notion of the rational. It's literally like a tic-tac-toe board. You've got the foreground where all the figures are laid across the surface. You've got a very clearly defined middle space in the squares that you see actually in the paving, and then beyond the screen of columns. And the columns are Doric. That is the simplest, most severe of the ancient orders.
And the linear perspective will take us to a vanishing point, which is where the hands and the swords meet. So that's clearly the emotional focus of this painting. The male figures who are taking this heroic oath are contrasted with the female figures who are dominated by curvilinear, soft forms compared to the angular forms of the men.
What's interesting is that this painting was a commission by the King of France and was exhibited in the Salon in the Louvre in 1785. Now, there's a little bit of showmanship here because David painted this painting in Italy, and the Salon was open for a few weeks, but the painting actually came late. But there was a fairly prominent place for the painting up on the wall, and it was blank, and people really wanted to see it. There were apparently quite a number of sort of rumors about this radical new painting that this young artist was putting forward. And when it finally was put up, the crowds were so great that the Salon had to extend itself so that everybody who wanted to see it could see it.
Yeah, David really introduced an entirely new kind of painting, an example of virtue, of virtuous behavior, of the idea of sacrificing oneself for a good, for a principle that clearly resonated with people and clearly resonated especially at the time of the revolution.
And it's important to note that those ideals are expressed not only through the narrative, but through the very style of painting itself.
This postmodern work by Barbara Kruger testifies to the bravado and strength of men once again, but words contradict the image. Iconography is the study of themes and symbols in art. Bronzino's Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time is filled with mythological icons, symbols which can be read to make sense of this puzzle of flesh and body parts. About 1546, Bronzino was commissioned to create this painting. It displays the ambivalence, eroticism, and obscure imagery that are characteristic of the Mannerist period, enjoyed and understood by the wealthy aristocracy of Italy and France. The picture was given as a gift to the King of France. The two central figures are easily identified by their attributes as being Venus and Cupid. For example, Venus holds the golden apple won in the Judgment of Paris, and Cupid sports the characteristic wings and quiver. Both figures are brightly nude, and Cupid fondles his mother's bare breast and kisses her lips. The bearded, bald figure to the upper right of the scene is believed to be Time, in view of the hourglass behind him. The figure opposite him, and also grasping at drapery, is usually called Oblivion because of the lack of substance to his form, eyeless sockets, and mask-like head. And the mask-like face of this figure is echoed by the image of two actual masks in the lower right-hand corner. The identity of the remaining figures is even more ambiguous. The old woman rending her hair has been often called Jealousy. The creature at the right-hand side behind Folly, with the girl's face and grotesque body, extending a honeycomb with her left hand attached to her right arm, may represent Pleasure and Fraud. The boy scattering roses and stepping on a thorn could be identified as Jest, Folly, and Pleasure. Formalist criticism is the process of evaluating a work of art based solely upon the objective visual characteristics such as the elements of art and the principles of design. A group discussion about an artwork is called a critique. Critique the following works according to the formal elements and principles of design. Does the work have unity? What is the focal point? How does your eye move through the painting? Also critique the works according to the message you receive from the content of visual symbols and iconography. Does color have any psychological effect? Are icons or religious symbols used?
The Kiss by Auguste Rodin is one of the most popular works in Tate's collection, and today you'd hardly consider it shocking or provocative. But it hasn't always been this way. When it was first shown in this country in 1914, its erotic subject matter caused a scandal. It had to be covered with a tarpaulin and hidden away in a stable block. The story behind the creation of The Kiss and how it came to enter Tate's collection is a fascinating one.
Rodin was one of the preeminent sculptors of the modern era. He challenged the academic traditions of late 19th century art and took sculpture in a new direction. In 1880, at the age of 40, Rodin was commissioned to make a monumental bronze doorway for a new museum in Paris. He called them the Gates of Hell. Rodin's inspiration was Dante's Inferno, characters from which Rodin modelled as reliefs on the doors. They included the tragic lovers Paolo and Francesca, who later became the couple in The Kiss. Paolo was the brother of Francesca's husband, and Dante tells how their love was first kindled when they sat together and read the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. but in their moment of passion they were discovered by Francesca's husband and murdered. If you look at the kiss, you can just make out in Paolo's hand the book they were reading before they succumbed to their passion. Rodin eventually decided to detach the figures and make them into an independent sculpture. There are some wonderful early studies for the kiss, including a small, almost abstract terracotta model in which he rehearses the pose as if trying to distill the very essence of forbidden passion. The Tate's Kiss is one of 3 larger-than-life-size marble sculptures Rodin produced on the subject. The first was commissioned by the French government in 1888. 10 years later, when Rodin finally finished the sculpture, it went on show in Paris, where it was considered a great success. One person who fell in love with the kiss in Paris was British artist William Rothenstein. He persuaded a collector friend of his to commission the version that we find today in the Tate. Rothenstein's friend was the eccentric American collector Edward Perry Warren. Warren lived in Lewes House in Sussex with his lover John Marshall, and together they entertained a brotherhood of artists, dealers and scholars.
Warren saw Rodin as the modern inheritor of the classical Greek tradition. This may explain a rather unorthodox letter to Rodin, in which he asked that in his version of the kiss, the man's genitals be clearly sculpted in the Greek tradition, rather than modestly hidden.
Warren paid Rodin 20,000 French francs for the sculpture, a large sum at the time. But when the kiss finally arrived here in 1904, it was put into the stables. It isn't known whether this was because it was too big for the house or simply because it failed to live up to Warren's expectations. In 1914, Warren lent it to Lewes Town Council for display in the town hall. But its amorous subject matter scandalised local residents. Shortly afterwards, soldiers were billeted in the town hall at the start of the war, and it was hastily draped in a tarpaulin, lest it overexcite the troops. After Warren's death in 1928, the kiss was put up for auction, but failed to reach its asking price. In 1952, the Tate launched a public appeal to buy the sculpture for the nation, for the bargain price of £7,500. "A kiss that's worth £7,500, said the French cartoonist in Dimanche. "That's expensive for a kiss." "Yes, but it lasts a long time." Over the years, other artists have paid homage to the kiss. In this etching, Marcel Duchamp outlines the lovers, but in typically subversive spirit. A slight change to the position of the man's hand suggests a far more intimate caress. More recently, British artist Cornelia Parker tied it up in string, an act of bondage that perhaps captures the spirit of Rodin's original, both its erotic power and the pain of love.
Bosch's Hell, and Bosch is the painter of hell, shows in excruciating detail the punishments meted out to those who do not deserve their place in heaven. And according to the medieval texts, there is no vice that will not receive its proper retribution. Proud and lecherous women are condemned to endure the attentions of toads and lizards, and their image is reflected in the polished bottom of an animal tree. Alcoholics who have spent their lives in taverns drinking and gambling are cut into pieces or pierced by knives. Musicians guilty of having charmed the senses, lust is the music of the flesh, say the scriptures, are tortured by their instruments, which have taken on monstrous proportions.
Magritte's The Treachery of Images from 1929, or also called N'est pas un pipe. This is not a pipe.
Okay, but it's a hilarious painting.
It is hilarious. It's an incredibly real painting of a pipe.
Magritte paints in this incredibly wonderful, matter-of-fact, kind of absolutely mundane, illustrative style.
Yes, like he was illustrating a catalog.
And with the words underneath, it's as if you're looking at one of the flashcards you would have as a child.
Right, that would say pipe, but it says, this is not a pipe.
That's right. And of course, he's right. It's not a pipe.
It's
a painting of a pipe.
But it is a pipe.
Where is the authority? Do we believe what we're seeing in the veracity of the illustration, the sort of perfect representation of the almost platonic pipe?
It's the oar pipe.
It's the oar pipe,
yes.
Right, exactly. Or do we believe the text underneath, which tells us it's not a pipe? Which is stronger, the representation of the thing or the language that denies it?
For me?
Yeah, for you.
The picture of the pipe.
The picture of the pipe is more powerful than the language.
Yes.
That's so interesting, because I think for most, and maybe that's because you're an art historian, and you just
maybe that's why I became an art historian.
Maybe so.
I believe whatever I see.
Because so many people believe what they read, and in a sense I think the language has a kind of authority. But for me, it is this sort of perfect, almost balance and struggle between the two, where I just absolutely accept that pipe. It's there. It's this pipe. It's this perfect representation of a pipe. And the language is completely denying it and has tremendous authority as well. And it's this fantastic tension between that presentation and then that rejection of the presentation.
And then, of course, there's the word pipe, which is, in a way, just as much of an abstraction from the actual item of the pipe.
Okay. So the representation of the pipe is twofold. There's the representation of the pipe
as an image,
this iconic.
And then there's the word.
So this linguistic symbol.
Yeah.
Right, and they're both not a pipe.
They're both not a pipe.
That's right. They're both actually ways of representing a pipe, or our notion of what that pipe is in somebody's mouth somewhere.
What else could this be a picture of?
Well,
it's a picture of, it is a pipe.
So it is.
It's
so
like,
you're denying the text.
They occupy the same area. They're both in the painting.
Yeah. Okay, so when Magritte paints this, he's clearly challenging this notion of authority and which and what, and it's really playful.
And also it's just challenging the whole illusionistic history of Western art, right?
No question about it. And he's doing it again with a kind of faux naturalism, right? With this kind of self-conscious naturalism, which really sort of transcends naturalism in its sort of self-reference.
Perfectly painted in
but also perfectly written text. Because the script is again the kind of didactic script that you would find in a kindergarten classroom, right? Which is really meant to be instructive and meant to be full of authority.
Right.
And so this is a painting really about the denial of authorities of language and representation,
guess so.
isn't it?
I remember when my daughter was really little, and I woke up every morning and she looked at books of pictures just like this one.
That's right.
And then pointed, and I had to give her the names for things.
And you could have really screwed her up by giving her a book which said, this is
not a pipe.
He actually is going to call it an Easter mood, and you do have the three trees, and you can think of it as Christian symbolism with three crosses. But he, as he's working on it, says, you know, I want a more non-committal kind of title, so I'm going to call it an April mood. April can be a rather tumultuous time. He wanted this brooding, stormy, unsettled atmosphere in it, and yet a promise of something great coming with spring. There's always this music going on in his head too, which can be a subtext to an awful lot of the paintings. Music is probably more of an influence than any other artist in terms of people that he respected. He especially liked the music of Beethoven and Sibelius, and associated with the kind of romanticism of their music, and hoped that he could accomplish in painting what he felt they accomplished, and that there was a drama to the music that he also wanted to try to translate visually. Even the Sun and Rocks, for example, where he's hearing Beethoven in the background, like this Fifth Symphony or the Ninth Symphony, when he's painting this, and he's thinking of it as these ancient gods that are hurling boulders, and we might not see that when we look at the painting ourselves, but for him these were these influences and subtexts to the imagery.
I've never accepted any pressure from the outside on putting clothing on my figures. Most of my figures that I create are nude, except for this series, which is called the Liberation Series, which is exactly that. Us liberating ourselves from our binds and our confines that we have on our soul, and removing them so we can become our authentic and true selves.
This painting may not be familiar to you as many other paintings in the DIA, but it's one of those works that when my colleagues come here, other directors, and we walk into this gallery, they say, oh right, you've got that picture. It's one of the iconic paintings of the Romantic movement. It was painted by a man called Henry Fuseli, born in Switzerland but moved to England early in his career and anglicized his name. And when it was shown, and he had a bit of a reputation as a strange man too, so when this painting was shown, people were, well, initially baffled by it because it doesn't have a subject matter, it doesn't have a story that you, even if it's obscure, you can track it down somewhere in literature. Nobody knew what to make of it, except of course some clergymen decided that it was obscene and that this kind of thing should not be shown to the general public. But what you see, of course, first is this woman lying on her bed, stretched out in a very vulnerable position, with the goblin on top. And that is the mare of nightmare. It comes from the Old English word mara, and it meant a goblin or a witch. And so the witch or the goblin is sitting on the chest of this woman, giving her the nightmares. And in the background you see a mare, which presumably references the mare part of it, the horse part of it, that most people like me used to think of immediately.
Doll based on Cupid just enjoyed its 100th birthday. It quickly became a merchandising powerhouse. It was born in 1909 right here in southwest Missouri. In tonight's My Ozarks, KSPR's Doug Magditch takes us to Bonnybrook near Branson and introduces us to Rose O'Neal, Cupid's creator.
By 1909, Rose O'Neal was already a successful illustrator.
She did over 5,000 illustrations in different magazines and publications.
She had homes in Connecticut, New York, and southwest Missouri.
The house at Bonnybrook was built with Rose's money.
For O'Neal, Bonnybrook became a getaway.
She just liked the people and the laid-back way of life in the Ozarks.
It's here she invented the Cupid, with this letter to the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal.
This was Cupid's Christmas Frolic.
In December of 1909, America met her creation.
This was the first issue that had the Cupids in it.
People just fell in love with them. They were this sweet little character who went around doing good deeds in a funny way. This is the room she was in when she created the Cupid.
Not the same room, but a recreation of it. 3 years after O'Neal died, Bonnybrook burned to the ground.
Those are things that went through the fire.
In 1993, the Rose O'Neal Historical Society rebuilt the home on its original foundation.
It's a real good reproduction of the house.
A way to preserve the memory of one of the area's most influential artists. And not just because of the Cupid.
This was the type of work that Rose really liked to do.
Cupids brought in the money and gave O'Neal the freedom to illustrate a series she called Sweet Monsters.
Her monsters were really never evil or never bad. They were just different. You know, she believed that everybody should be treated the same, whether they were different or not.
A message she fought for.
She was very important as far as her social issues, philanthropy, her suffrage work.
Cupids were genderless, and O'Neal believed voting rights should be too.
She believed that women should have just as much of a vote as men. I think southwest Missouri does not know about her or appreciate her. To the extent that if they knew just all of what she did and all she was involved in, that they would appreciate her more.
At Bonnybrook, Doug Magditch, KSPR News.
Those qualities.
Okay.
This is Pontormo's painting of the entombment?
That's right. Generally, this is thought of as being an entombment, and what we see represented is the Virgin Mary in blue, who is being consoled by the people around her. And then here is the figure of Christ, who is being supported by the two figures underneath him, and they are carrying him away from the Virgin Mary in this direction. And so the idea is that this is the scene that immediately follows something like the Pietà or the Lamentation, where Christ is lying on his mother's lap. This is the scene immediately after that when Christ is being carried away in this direction towards the tomb, and so we call this an entombment.
And it's a painting that just screams to me that it's not a Renaissance painting anymore, because for so many reasons. I mean, most obviously, I guess, to me, is the fact that all the figures are compressed into the foreground, and that whole Renaissance interest in an illusion of space created by atmospheric and linear perspective, and having a foreground and a middle ground and a background. You know, everything seems compressed into about 3 feet here.
Exactly. There's no rational sense of space. There's no rational sense of depth. The kinds of things that we're used to seeing in high Renaissance art, where its emphasis is on logic and legibility, those things seem to have been discarded. Additionally, there's a lot of ambiguity and things that are sort of illogical. Like, for instance, if this is the body of Christ, who is a dead 33-year-old man, how is it possible that the two figures underneath him are supporting him simply by standing on their tiptoes as if he's completely weightless? This is so ambiguous that some scholars have even suggested that these are angels who are actually lifting Christ up into heaven rather than carrying him away from the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, and the expressions on their faces also don't indicate that they're, you know, straining themselves in any way.
Exactly. And like you said, there's this sense of drama and the hand gestures, but there's also this sense of incredible elegance. Again, we can see the very, very elongated figures, like the figure of that figure who's carrying Christ underneath his arms, the other ones in the background. Even the figure of Christ is this elongated, elegant, S-shaped curve. And so what we're seeing is that the clarity of the subject matter, the drama of the narrative, as it's told in the text of the Bible, is being subordinated to an emphasis on an illogical sophistication, a sense of ambiguity, and a sense of gracefulness. And it's this that is becoming standard in Mannerism, and some people point to this painting as one of the first real Mannerist paintings of the period. Something else I'd like to point out that's kind of illogical is the light source. This is something else that high Renaissance artists paid a lot of attention to and tried to make...
Beginning with Masaccio, really.
Exactly. They tried to make it look very logical, and here we see some ambiguity in the sense that is the light coming from the left, where it's lighting up the back of this figure's tunic, or is it actually coming from the right, where the tunic also seems to be lit up, but in a completely different color, which again is kind of confusing and strange.
The colors are strange.
The colors are very strange, and again, what it contributes to is a sense of the image being very pretty, because you have these light colors, these pastel, candy colors, that add to that sense of prettiness, which is sort of not in accordance with the subject matter.
Right. I've always been fascinated by this figure in particular, whose sort of body really doesn't seem to make sense. We seem to have a kind of frontal view of this figure's calf, and yet the figure seems to be twisting if you look at the other leg. And also, what always seemed odd to me and very different from the High Renaissance is that the way that this composition has, in a way, nothing in its center. Where a High Renaissance painting like Leonardo's Last Supper or Raphael's School of Athens would have the most important figures in the center. Here we have a composition not based on a pyramid, which is the normal shape for a composition in the High Renaissance, which is very stable, which leads your eye to the top of the pyramid. But here a composition in the shape of a circle where our eye just kind of goes around and never rests anywhere.
Something else I'd like to point out that's a little odd is we see the back of a woman's head here. She's the figure who's supporting Christ's hands, but we don't see her legs. There's no clear indication of where she's standing. And in fact, when you look at it, sometimes there could be some ambiguity that would lead you to think that these hands holding the hand of Christ actually belong to this person way up here, which would give that person incredibly long, strange arms. A similar illusion is created by this figure dressed in green, because we see at the bottom all of this green fabric, which almost looks like it could belong to the figure way up here, but of course that wouldn't make any sense
at all. And how is that figure up there? I mean, we don't see a ladder. There's no rational explanation for why that figure is back up here,
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, everything is subordinated to a sense of elegance and sophistication, and that's maybe even where the term mannerism comes from, because the Italian word maniera means style. And so one way to think of mannerism is that it is the stylish style. In other words, it is the style about being stylish, about being elegant, about being fashionable, and about the artist showing off his technical skill. If we look at a detail, we can see here, for instance, that it's not that Pontormo didn't know how to represent things accurately or skillfully. Look at the hands, for instance, next to Christ's body. The draftsmanship there is quite exceptional, but what he's doing is he's showing off his draftsmanship, he's showing off his ability to be elegant, and the more complicated and engaging the image was, even to the point of enigma and confusion, the more successful it was as a Mannerist image.
And so one idea about why mannerism happens in this way or develops into the kind of style that it is that the artists of the High Renaissance had sort of taken that naturalism of the High Renaissance as far as it was going to be able to go. And that, you know, they needed to be able to do something different, and that they had, during the High Renaissance, artists had achieved such an amazing level with their technical skill in representing reality that it now became interesting to show off that skill.
Absolutely, and that there was a sense that all of the possibilities in the High Renaissance, naturalism, legibility, balance, those things had already been worked out to their fullest, and so the newer generation of artists, like Pontormo, they needed to go in another direction. And that point that you raise about the High Renaissance is a good opportunity to compare this entombment to one actually by Raphael. Here's Raphael's entombment. This is a typical High Renaissance image because look, for instance, at how the figures actually visibly strain under the weight of the dead body of Christ. Look at how the emotions are very, very clearly depicted, especially the Virgin Mary who's fainted here. Look at how the sense of depth and space is represented so rationally and clearly, where you can see into the landscape, into the distance. There's atmospheric perspective. The figures are to scale depending on where they're positioned. The story is told clearly because we even see the crosses in the background, even with the ladder that was used to lower Christ's body. There's a tremendous sense of clarity.
The story is clearly told, absolutely.
Everything corresponds to the text and to the message that's trying to be communicated.
And even the way that the figures are arranged here, everyone has their, you know, there's this focus compositionally, even if they're not looking at Christ, there's a focus on Christ.
Absolutely.